Morning, everybody. As Jonathan said, definitely seeing the impact of the reveling of last night on our early morning crowd. Good to see you guys again. I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of ground travel. We talked a lot about cars yesterday. This is not about real estate as much as vehicles. And it's a little bit about my journey and the observations I've made and where I think that ground travel is headed, as well as in some implications around marketplaces that are going to be built around that space. We met yesterday, but just to reintroduce myself for those that I haven't gotten to connect with, I spent a journey building a company called Taxi Magic, kind of the Netscape of the Uber space, the first in mobile ground travel. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But the basic premise, you push a button on your phone, and it's a marketplace that would go out and reach out to taxi companies, bring a taxi to your house or wherever you are, and then do the entire transaction electronically. Spent some time at the U.S. Department of Energy, investing in energy technology like battery technology, and then most recently built a company called Shift.com that sells cars online, one of the, what I think Jonathan called the iDealers in the marketplace today. So the question that I'm posing is, hey, what is the future of the personal mobility marketplace? Want to go back and do a little bit of history and then take us through where I think that thing is headed. This one's a little bit more, it might sound a little bit more out there. To some of you, it'd be like, hey, that's obvious. To others of you, it'd be like, whoa, that's completely different. But I'm interested in sparking a conversation and a good set of questions. I'm going to try and leave time for good dialogue on that at the end. So historically, and this is still to a large degree where we are, just to level set, the auto industry, and this is fairly US-centric, so forgive me on that one, but it has implications in other countries. Individuals tend to have about 2 cars per household here in the US. The cars are inefficient. 95% of the time, they sit idle. Environmentally, it's a real challenge, and geopolitically, those are a real challenge. About half of the oil that is consumed by OECD countries goes into passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks. And about 15 to 17% of global emissions come from those fleets. So you've got what on its surface looks like actually a pretty inefficient use of technology, deployment of capital, and kind of allocation of resources. So mobile technology in around the 2008, 2009 timeframe began to enable a different way of accessing these vehicles. One of the things that I got to do is build a company called Taxi Magic. And we basically were building Java apps for BlackBerries in 2007. So this is a couple of years before we were. Actually, while we're on this, why don't we do a quick poll? How many people have heard of Taxi Magic, just real quick? Now, how many people have heard of Uber? Yeah, like a lot more, right? So let me tell you, I'll give a brief cul-de-sac into why. We built essentially a managed marketplace for taxis. And you could go on, push a button on your BlackBerry, and then later iPhone. We were the first iPhone app on the App Store that would allow you to actually summon a vehicle and pay for it electronically. And what would happen is the passengers would do that, and they loved it. People were like, wow, this is a great way to get access to a taxi, particularly in places like San Francisco. We built out in 30 cities across the US because in places like San Francisco, there were 5 taxis, and we could summon all of them. And so what people found, though, was periodically the driver would be going to pick them up, and on the way, would see somebody on the street with a carry-on bag. And they'd say, whoa, that's a good ride. That's going to be an airport ride. So they would not fulfill our order and instead go pick up that person off the street and drive them to the airport. Now, that was kind of a problem for us. We thought we were like a marketplace. We thought we were like Expedia. If United is late, it's not on Expedia that United is late. But in fact, users blamed us. So mini lesson on that was people said, hey, because the taxis could pick other people up and the reliability was low, Taxi Magic had trouble. Meanwhile, Uber, Lyft, others, they created proprietary supply. Breaking the law, no doubt, but they created an end-to-end experience for their consumers in a managed marketplace fashion. Important lesson there. You also then see folks like Getaround, Turo coming along, using mobile technology to enable people to share cars. But in this case, the ground travel is by and large owned by an individual and provided by a driver who is coming with the car and the driving. I believe that the next stage of that thing is for these vehicles to go electric. So we're already seeing that happen. Roughly 30% of Americans want an electric vehicle, 70% of Italians are interested in an electric vehicle, and that's going to converge in the high 90s before long. So we're going to see a transformation in the nature of these fleets, as well as the connectivity of these vehicles. Next, and this is happening already. How many people, most haven't done this, but places like Phoenix and San Francisco, Cruise, Waymo, they have live pilots driving right now with autonomous vehicles and no person in the car except for the passenger. Like, you can literally sign up for their pilot programs and ride around. So we're in the beginnings of what I think is a revolution, particularly in defined spaces that LiDAR can basically map well and be able to drive into an autonomous vehicle. Now, there's the quote, we always overestimate what can happen in the next 2 years and underestimate what can happen in the next 10. I think it's very realistic that we see those pilots scaling significantly to larger areas and cities and becoming a common feature of autonomous electric vehicles driving with being able to be summoned via mobile app. I don't think any of that is terribly controversial. It's mostly a question of when. And that tees up the then important question. Great, who's going to own those vehicles? And I would posit to you that the way that those networked EVs that are self-driven, they actually won't be owned by big fleets. So you won't see like Waymo own all the cars. You won't see Uber own all the cars, or Zoox, or even an OEM. That they're actually going to be shared and owned by individuals and mini fleets, as well as some mega fleets, and rented back out on the network. And that there'll be 1 to 2 networks that are going to be able to connect all those individually and mini fleet owned vehicles and aggregate up that supply to meet demand. Now you might be like, why would that be? Why wouldn't a single OEM, Uber or Google, just own all those cars? And I'd say there's 2 main reasons. One, the nature of this marketplace, the ground travel marketplace, is one that has major network effects. You get a flywheel going by having more supply begets more passengers begets more supply. That is not true in all marketplaces. That's actually not true there's a degree to which it's true in a place like auto retail, but it's massively true in high-frequency transactions like taxi. And the reason is the reliability and the speed at which you can get a car is a huge, just a massive draw for passengers. And for those supplying the vehicle, the drivers in today and the renters, so to speak, or the vehicle Airbnbers, if you will, of tomorrow, they're going to want to know that their vehicle is being highly utilized quickly. And that sustains a pretty intense network dynamic, which is why we saw the Lyft and Uber wars of 2010 to 2020. They spent billions of dollars fighting each other over passengers and drivers because the network effects are so intense. An analogy that you might see is something like Visa or MasterCard. You might say, hey, why would Visa or MasterCard not get into banking? Why don't they actually own the customer, underwrite the customer, lend to the customer, you name it? And the answer is because the nodes on the network are what create power of the network. The equation, roughly speaking, is n times n minus 1 is the power of a network, which means as you add nodes, you get more and more power to that thing. So really you want to be reaching, in the case of Visa and MasterCard, every merchant possible and every consumer possible. And if you're trying to be the bank, so to speak, that tailors to that consumer, you're narrowing the number of people that you can serve. And you want to avoid narrowing the number of people you can serve. A massive way to narrow the number of people you can serve in the ground travel market would be to try to own your own cars. And in part, that's especially impacted because this is a capital-intense market. If you look at the history of taxis, most taxis, like in New York, wouldn't be owned by one massive fleet or by a city. They'd be owned by individuals. And so what you'd see with Uber is basically Uber, Lyft, they've never owned vehicles. And they're not interested in being in the business of owning vehicles. They're a network. They want to connect and be a marketplace for those vehicles. And by definition, almost any one large player is going to be far smaller than everyone else in a world where vehicles can be networked. So even if you're Ford and you're producing, let's say, the most EVs of anyone in the world, you're going to be a small fraction of the total vehicles produced on the planet, and trying to own create the network effects by owning all of your own vehicles will be virtually impossible. And so the thesis here is what we're going to see in ground travel, and I would posit within 10 years, is networked EVs that are self-driven and rented out, provided by individuals and accessible to everyone, both urban and then moving out into suburban places. A shared network zero-emission infrastructure that allows everyone to access these things. Now, what becomes interesting is, hey, what does this mean? It means whole new marketplaces and an entirely new dynamic across the ground travel and auto space. A fundamental change in the way you think about auto retailing and lending. Folks will be buying a car not just to be able to use it for themselves, but the underwriting will include, hey, how much rental income can you expect from that thing? Because the barrier to renting your own car out, although you can do it on Turo and get around today, goes way down. You'll literally be able to sign your car up to go out and serve the network when you're not using it, and to come back and pick you up when you are. Intraday rental of your own vehicle. Second, vehicle maintenance and charging. We'll see massive networks. Being able to charge an autonomous vehicle that rolls up, needs a charge, and needs to jump back onto the network, the cars will literally take themselves for maintenance. So we're going to see a marketplace for maintenance hubs where the cars go and charge and maintain themselves. Entirely new ecosystem emerging. Energy production and storage marketplaces will become a massive opportunity. Each of those vehicles that is going to be out on that network is going to be a mobile storage battery. Today, an electric vehicle is worth roughly $500 to a utility to be able to decide when to charge it so that they can manage peak load at any given time. Once those things are both mobile and networked, the utilities will be able to selectively place charges and move over to things like wind and solar, which don't perform all the time. And that will be a transformational aspect for us being able to move from a very, very stable and predictable energy sources, gas and oil, to less stable because we'll be able to dynamically charge across that network of vehicles. And finally, last mile delivery. How do you get a pizza in a world where the vehicle is autonomous and electric? The pizza company puts it into a delivery vehicle, and the delivery vehicle comes to you and is summoned. And it's going to absolutely transform the way that we're doing last mile logistics within these electric vehicle networks. And there's going to be a ton more marketplaces and dynamics that happen as a result of, I believe, this not that far off future. So with that, I say all of this in the spirit of trying to wake you guys up early in the morning with a provocative future view, thoughts and questions opportunity after a big night of reveling.
So can we get Slido up, please? So while we wait for the Slido questions, maybe I could just kick off with one. So, if you look at this world of having a network owner or network owners, who do you think's best positioned to move into that role of network owner?
I think that's a really fascinating question and a difficult one. I think what we're going to see is a battle between OEMs saying we're going to keep proprietary access to our vehicles and the operating systems on them. The folks who are saying, hey, we're going to provide the technology that makes these vehicles autonomous, the LiDAR systems, you're saying the Waymos and the Cruises of the world. And then eventually, the ones who are theoretically best positioned would be the Ubers and the Lyfts, because they've already built up a network of passengers. And I think they are probably the presumptive winners in this one. And what they have to do is figure out how to work with OEMs / autonomous vehicle technology providers to be able to get these things onto their networks. But they do have existing networks. I wouldn't say that it's as obvious that it's like, hey, Visa and MasterCard are a threat from, say, Bitcoin, because the existing network actually could be adapted, I believe, relatively naturally to this. And I think it's plausible that we continue to see this duopoly kind of play. But it's kind of anybody's game as to how really the autonomous technology percolates into the system.
I mean, presumably it's such a big market, you could see multiple networks.
I actually, because of the network effects, Jonathan, it's the same thing. We didn't see that as we were building Taxi Magic and then watch things play out with Lyft and Uber. It's actually hard to sustain multiple networks. It's a big market, but when you're talking about getting down to market size of, hey, how many cars are literally outside this building right now? Who has that coverage? Because you as a user aren't like, I need on average, the number of cars they have in Miami. You're saying, I need to know how many cars they have within 3 minutes of this building. And so the density that's required of that supply to get the car to you in the time you're willing to wait outside this building right now requires incredible density to pull that off. And it's hard to have multiple players playing at that with any consistency. And so what you do see is major consolidation effects on that because of these deep, deep network effects.
So, top question. At this point, self-driving is almost like fusion power, always 10 years away. What do you think it will take to get regulatory acceptance of full self-driving?
So this is one that even I've been watching this since 2007. As I mentioned, our biggest problem at Taxi Magic was the driver would bug off. And I was like, oh, the future is going to be autonomous. We got to figure out a way to create these network cars that allow for this to happen. So I get the point of having watched it for a while. What struck me and where I was like, wow, this is real. I mean, how many people have seen or were aware before we had this conversation that Waymo and Cruise have actually live people, like people not as part of their companies, currently getting into cars, being able to summon and get into cars as taxi systems in San Francisco, Phoenix, et cetera? How many people knew that that was happening right now? Just a quick show of hands. So roughly the number of people who knew that who had heard of Taxi Magic previously. Go figure. As a little joke there for you. But the point is that we're unaware at this moment that those pilots are live. They are actually open to the public. You can sign up on Waymo or Cruise to ride in a fully autonomous vehicle. There's a guy who's done a bunch of really cool YouTube video on this. I think he's logged 50 or 100 of his rides in Phoenix. He talks through all the issues. I got to watch one of his videos. I thought it was really fascinating, where he talks about how one of the cars had real trouble, like at navigating around cones and issues, and he talks about how the support came out and they sent people out to help him, and they got the car back on track, et cetera. So there's sort of managed spaces in two cities, and like non-trivial cities, Phoenix and or Tempe and San Francisco are like real substantial American cities that will serve as useful test cases for this live today. And so when a pilot is live today, the question is, how long does it take to iron out the kinks and scale that thing? I don't know, but when you've got live tech, you can start doing things like college campuses and manage spaces relatively quickly, and that becomes a reality in certain pockets, and pockets tend to spread relatively quickly into broader geographies. In terms of the regulatory that's needed, I haven't thought through all that, but it's at its core, I think that cities are actually really going to be really keen for this kind of change, by and large. Not every city, but the nice thing in a place like the US is the decision-making ends up happening at a local level. So you don't have to convince the federal government to do it everywhere. One or two cities can do it, show success, and everybody's like, get me there. The US Conference of Mayors does a great job of spreading around best practices and what people have learned, and I think that there's a real opportunity for innovation in that regard.
So top question again, would it not be possible that cars are connected to multiple networks and accept rides from the network that offers them the best price?
So I think that's exactly what's going to happen, is that what we're going to see is, just like drivers today, most of the drivers that you've ridden with, Lyft, Uber, they have the little Lyft sign and they got the little Uber sticker. The drivers are on both networks. And but you can only sustain one or two of those. A driver being on 30 networks becomes cumbersome. And so I think there's going to be a limit to the number of networks that drivers and riders are willing to jump between, because once you get to 30 networks on each side, the riders and the drivers are having to do a lot of work to figure out how to match with each other. You're constantly having to check 7, 8, 9 apps before you can find the driver, and that's the definition of not network effect. At that point, you'd see like meta networks who are saying, hey, let me do a quick check on top of all of them, and I'll steer you to the one that you would need. You'd see like a marketplace on those things. So I do think that the two will be there, but everybody will be playing on the two.
So yesterday was about making money on the money when you spoke. Yeah. What's the underlying business model here? Is it insurance, a finance, payment platform, or something else? So
I think there are a bunch of different business models that will happen. I tend to think that the financing of the vehicles and the selling of the vehicles will actually, because it remains a highly distributed function, it's going to remain being basically what we talked about yesterday. A few larger players who are able to get real scale and finance those things, but finance and distribute out the risk among a lot of different people. From there, I think a lot of the money will be just paying for the rides. There's going to be, we pay for transport today, and there's a very legitimate business model for paying for delivery and transport, which essentially, if you look at Uber Eats and Uber, that's essentially the business that they're in. They transport goods and people around urban areas. And I think that core business model will continue. The difference is you're going to be removing one of the biggest cost aspects, and that is the driver. Yes, there's going to be a lot of CapEx for the new self-driving vehicles, but that CapEx is going to taper down. And as that CapEx tapers down, you're actually going to see a really attractive business model of being able to have essentially machines move people and goods very efficiently and in a carbon-free environment.
So a question from me. I mean, you talk about this world of people still owning cars, cars going into the network, etc. And clearly a lot of our audience own businesses that are based around selling cars, trading cars, marketing cars, etc. Do you think car ownership is going to fall dramatically in this world, or because it's this kind of networked view of you have your own car, it can join the network, will there still be a very high level of car ownership in this future?
I think that the number, we started out the conversation with, at least in the United States, people own 2 to 3 cars. So I think that 2 to 3 becomes 1 to 2. So you'll need less vehicles because a lot of the, it'll be much easier to get around when you don't need to have your own vehicle. But, and I got this question a lot as we were starting Shift, hang on, with Uber, doesn't car ownership go away? And the short answer is no. I think in this world, there very much is car ownership. And for the reasons that I described, the network effect and the capital effects, people will continue to own vehicles. And for those of us who have kids, if you've ever pulled a car seat in and out of a car, you're like, I am never gonna not have my car seat in the car. Jumping from Uber to Uber is almost impossible. And people do wanna continue to have their vehicles. It's not just a transport item. People will have their hockey bag in the back of the car or a stroller that they need to be able to hang on to, and they don't wanna move that thing in and out of the vehicle. So I believe that ownership is here to stay. Car ownership will not end. If nothing else, there's in the apocalypse situation, or in a hey, I got to get to the emergency room during COVID quickly. People want to have a true no way this thing is going to be there for sure. So I think at least one car will still be associated with each household. The beauty of it though is the financing of that vehicle will get much more interesting because that vehicle becomes a revenue generator, not just a depreciation sink. That thing can be rented back out on a network relatively easily and drive itself to do it in a way that reduces a lot of the friction of trying to be on Turo or get around today.
So do you see a similar opportunity in other modes of transport, motorcycles, planes, etc.? And are you seeing autonomous drones and planes coming soon?
Yeah, autonomous drones coming soon. They'll be right here. It's a great question. I don't know the full answer to that one. I think we're seeing the beginnings of this with things like scooters. So people who can buy an electric scooter, or you can rent one on the street. I don't think we're seeing people rent out their scooters on the street just yet. But I think the dynamics at play here are pretty much perennial. Where there are network effects, you will see consolidation to 1-2 players. Where there's high capital cost, you're going to see a distribution of the bearing of that cost, because concentrating that capital cost all in one place in a network effect place is going to be a not winning value prop. So where you see a network effect and high capital cost, you're going to see networks occur and distribution of ownership and a lot of sharing.
So in your opinion, who will service cars in this car sharing model of the world? Is it going to be dealers or companies like Shift and Carvana, or somebody new? Is it the network that services the cars?
So I tend to think that you're going to end up seeing, I think there's a potential for the existing infrastructure will last for a while. But I think there's a very interesting alternative here as well. And that is, today, vehicle servicing is done on a bay model. You bring in your car, they lift up the car, they set down the car. I believe, and that is very different, and that's done for reconditioning and for servicing. That's very different than the way a car is made. Cars are made on a manufacturing line model, a factory floor model, and I think you get a lot of efficiency when you're able to do factory floor style maintenance, where you have an assembly line style as opposed to an individual bay model, 1 tech, 2 cars kind of model. Potentially, what you could see is, because the cars drive themselves, because maintenance is known and they are relatively smart, there would be an opportunity to set up outside the urban center where real estate is less expensive, a large factory-style maintenance program, and be able to systematize that, because the car would show up when it needs maintenance, does it on its own, and you'd be able to do an assembly line style, much lower cost play. So I could see something like that emerging as a way to maintain the vehicles. But the existing infrastructure is actually not terrible, particularly for one-offs. And so you can imagine that's going to be a longer change.
So how do you think the demographic of the US driving license is going to change? And is it still necessary for a young American to drive and own a car? I know in many other countries, certainly the level of license ownership, or at least the point at which licenses are applied for, is getting higher and higher at the moment.
So it's interesting. I have some friends who had a 16-year-old son, and he, as I was building Shift, he said to me at one point, he's like, I think that thing's going to be dead because I'm just never going to buy a car. Like in my generation, people just don't want to drive cars at all. And I got nervous. I was like, oh, is that real? Then he moved to LA. He now has a driver's license and drives a car. So, and the reason was, in this particular, and I think this is a useful and instructive case, he got really into climbing and outdoor stuff. Kind of hard to take an Uber up into the mountains for 5 hours. But because an Uber driver's like, I'm not sure I want to do that, and I'm going to hang out, and then once you're out there, the signal, it's hard to get. And so I think that there will still be important use case for car ownership. There's going to be an important use case for people having the ability to drive the vehicle. But in theory, I'm not sure that the younger generation will be licensed or unlicensed less. The real question is, hey, do people need licenses to be in cars at all? And as cars go into being more and more autonomous, you own the car if it's autonomous, and you can either rent it out on the network, either to the network or from the network. And if the vehicle is simply autonomous, you begin saying, wait, the whole goal of this technology is to remove humans from making decisions. It turns out, I mean this argument's been made a bunch. When you look at the deaths from autonomous vehicles and decision-making by machines, it's as or good as a human. Three things are problematic with humans. One, they get distracted. They do texting while driving. Two, they get drunk, and that's a huge problem. And three, they do a thing called not sleep more than 6 hours for 3 nights straight. And statistically speaking, if you don't sleep for more than 6 hours for 3 to 4 nights straight, you have the cognitive ability as though you were drunk. And most people don't realize that, and they go out and you can get in a car, and it's really rather dangerous. So I think there's a world where the whole focus of these autonomous vehicles is actually to replace the licensing and requirement and skill sets needed for humans.
So does this future destroy the big rental companies like Enterprise and the big fleet companies, corporate fleet companies like Arvel and LeasePlan?
So I think that's a fantastic question. I think the big rental companies are really good at managing large amounts of vehicle capital. Today, they have to acquire consumers, and they have to maintain those vehicles. I actually think that those rental companies become major providers on the networks that I just described. They are the mega fleets, the large fleets who own large numbers of vehicles, maintain them, and rent them out on the network. They're also potential contenders. I didn't answer this in your earlier question, Jonathan, or the earlier question. They are contenders to become the networks. That is a possibility that you'll see an Avis or a Hertz move in and make a bid to try and be one of those networks to displace an Uber or Lyft. And they might try and make that leap by saying, hey, at the outset, we have a large number of vehicles. We're going to deploy them in particular areas and try and win city by city. And by going in the early days, by being capital intensive and then moving to capital light, they might be able to gain an advantage. But I think there is a very, very big place for them in this future ecosystem, and that is as mega fleets renting onto the network.
So last question, Taxi Magic. Are we going to see Car Magic from you? Version 2 of Taxi Magic?
So Taxi Magic, you might wonder, hey, what happened at the end of that thing? It is actually bought by Verifone for the payments technology. And if you've ever been to a place like New York, you'll see the brand Curb are all over the vehicles. So Taxi Magic is now Curb, and it lives in places like that. Car Magic is, I thought, was Shift. And so you guys use Shift. Check out shift.com, and if you feel it's magical, I hope that was the philosophy. But in terms of what's next there, don't know.
Thank you very much, Toby. Really, really helpful, really useful.
Cool. Appreciate it.